Martin Griffiths, thanks for joining me on UpFront. This week in Sweden, you reached what many are calling a major breakthrough in peace talks between Houthi leaders and the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. Are we now a step closer to ending the war in Yemen?
Well, I certainly hope so. It's been 7 days of hard work here in Sweden, and both parties who came, the governor of Yemen and Ansar Allah, have worked a great deal to achieve these agreements, all of which will be published so that people can see what they can expect to happen in Yemen. I think it's a big step forward, but it's the first big step forward.
You didn't just get a prisoner swap, you got a ceasefire and a crucial deal on access to the port city of Hodeidah, which you've described as the center of gravity in this war. Will we now see a major and immediate and urgent increase in the amount of humanitarian aid getting into Yemen, which the UN has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis? Isn't that the priority?
Well, it is the priority, and I think the reason why we all focused very, very much on Hodeidah, and by the way, the United Nations and the UN Security Council has been focused on Hodeidah for many months because of our anxieties about the humanitarian pipeline being affected by any battle. And now I think we've put a spike in the road on that, so I think we will stop that happening. And the first thing that I hope will happen is that the United Nations World Food Programme will be able to play a supervisory role in the port, and it will backstop the Port Authority in the three ports of Hodeidah, Salif and Ras Isa. It'll be then for the members of the Security Council to decide, and to decide hopefully very, very quickly, whether a resolution is needed to provide a backing for the UN deployment that will need to happen in Hodeidah.
I get that you're a diplomat and a negotiator and you speak diplomatically, but you did say earlier this week, after an agreement on the release of prisoners in Yemen, that, quote, Yemenis should be proud of the people sitting around that table today. But if you were one of the 8 million Yemenis on the brink of a major famine, if you're one of the families of the thousands who have died in the war, in the cholera outbreak, the 22 million people who are in desperate need of food aid, should they really be proud of people on all sides who have brought such a horrific war to that country?
They should be proud of people whose presence here and whose decisions here create the conditions for peace and create the conditions for the humanitarian supplies that you've been describing. So in my career, not as a diplomat, but as a mediator, I've always wanted to try to understand how the people who manage wars can shift into producing peace. It's not easy. You have to take the moment, and we hope that one of the first moments in Yemen has been here in Sweden this week.
Isn't one of the problems with negotiations like this one that you bring both sides to the table as if they're equal parties, when in actual fact one side is a rebel group which has, yes, violated international laws, been accused of committing war crimes, but the other side is a Saudi-led coalition which supports the UN-recognized government, but which, according to the UN itself, is responsible for the vast majority of civilian casualties, for the tens of thousands of people who have died over the past few years?
My job is to find agreement between the parties to stop the war so the people of Yemen can be returned to a civil life. And the people who can stop that war are the people who are overseeing the fighting of it. And the conflict in Yemen is, as you say, between the legitimate government of Yemen and them and Ansar Allah. As a mediator, it's not actually my primary purpose to make political judgments about these two, although I'm guided obviously by Security Council resolutions, including the crucial one, 2216. But my job is to find places where the two can respect each other's decisions to change the narrative in Yemen. I profoundly believe, not just from Yemen, but from my other experience in other conflicts, this begins when you start listening to those two sides, when you start respecting them, and when you start helping them to find agreements that will move history. That's what we're here to do, rather than decide who's right, who's wrong, and why did this start in the first place.
Some say it's not just two sides, though. The problem with Yemen, they say, is that there's multiple sides. There's outside actors. It's become more of a proxy war than just a domestic civil war. Is that a fair assessment? Do you see this more of a proxy war than a civil war?
I see it as a strategic conflict, perhaps a slightly different perspective. I think Yemen resolving the conflict in Yemen is frankly as important for people in Europe because of the Red Sea shipping lanes and the trade routes that come through the Red Sea. In a sense, it's almost as it is for the region and the need for stability in the Gulf. The fact that member states in the region and beyond the region, frankly, have interests in stability in Yemen is not surprising, and nor should it shock us. Having said that, while we need to take those interests into account, and certainly in the United Nations, that's a natural issue for us to address, the emphasis in the process that I'm involved in is on Yemenis agreeing between Yemenis about ways to run Yemen. So it's not about other foreigners being around the table to make decisions. The people around this table in Sweden were all Yemenis. And I profoundly believe, and this is what the United Nations believes, that that is right and proper.
You say it's not shocking that other countries in the neighbourhood in the region should have interests in Yemen and beyond, but it was pretty shocking last month when reports emerged that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had lobbied UN Security Council members to stall a ceasefire resolution. As someone who's trying to get a ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire, surely that must shock you when parties to the conflict are lobbying your bosses at the UN Security Council at the UN building in New York to prevent such a deal.
I think there were many, many reasons why there were different views about that Security Council resolution. As a member of the UN Secretariat, I do not get drawn on the rights and wrongs of any resolution. That's for the members of that council. But if you ask me whether I'm shocked about whether parties to one conflict or another, or having some relationship to it, have strong views about issues related to it and its resolution, it would be absurd for me to be shocked about that. What I need to do is to understand why people have different approaches to resolving this conflict. I think that's perfectly normal. Every conflict you see that. We need to understand that so that we can actually find our way through it to resolve the conflict. It's easy to call for a ceasefire, and if somebody like me and you who want peace in the world, naturally stopping people killing each other has to be a good thing. But ceasefires are difficult to make work, and a ceasefire that is called for and then breaks doesn't build confidence, it breaks confidence, and it takes you backwards. So it's essential for somebody in the position that I'm in to look very carefully at the prospects for any ceasefire. How will it work? How will it build confidence? How will it save lives? And will it alternatively do the opposite and breach the confidence between the parties? So it's not a simple judgment.
Martin, you're an experienced negotiator. You worked extensively with 3 UN envoys to Syria. How difficult has this conflict in Yemen been to, quote-unquote, resolve, end, compared to an equally horrific Syrian conflict?
I feel, like all of us, extraordinarily sad about what's happened in Syria. I got involved firstly with Kofi Annan in 2012, then with his successor, Lakhdar Brahimi, and then Staffan de Mistura. And, we'd all had hopes from the beginning of that conflict that it would be soon resolved, a ceasefire in 2012. When I look at Yemen, in some sense it's simpler. It's perhaps at an earlier stage, even though it's a 4-year war, than something we see in Syria. And so when I look at Yemen, I think, let us resolve this now before it becomes even more intractable than it is. I think Yemen is a hope for the international community. It's a hope for the people of Yemen first. I think it can be resolved. The fact that we got these quite remarkable agreements in the last 7 days in Sweden gives us some idea that that hope could be true.
Just to push back on that point, and I hope you're right about the hope and about the agreements this week, but just to push back and say, do you understand why a lot of people around the world look at the UN in Syria, the UN in Yemen, the UN in Libya, maybe in Myanmar as well, and say, we've given up on this organization. It just doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't succeed in doing what it was supposed to succeed. Do you get why there's a lot of disillusionment with the UN across the globe right now?
Well, I think there's lots of different UNs, and I've worked in different parts of it. If you want to talk about the UN humanitarian agencies, whether in Syria or Yemen, I think that kind of comment is utterly unfair and utterly inaccurate. They do extraordinary work in times of great difficulty, and they save many, many lives. Now, in terms of peacemaking and negotiating, let's be very clear, and I don't say this to be pleading. It is the parties who decide to resolve a conflict. It is not the UN, it is not the mediator. It is their decision whether they will resolve a conflict or not. The decisions that were made this week in Sweden were not my decisions. I was here to help them come to those decisions. But it is their achievement, their compliance, their performance which is being watched, not mine. This isn't the UN, this is the parties to a conflict. And the UN's job, my job, is to do everything we can through diplomacy, through mediation, through urging, through patience, through listening, through respect, to give them the chance to do the right thing. But if they don't want to do the right thing, they won't.
Martin Griffiths, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Good luck.